She spent years judging and insulting him, but when her life hung by a thread, he was the only one who stepped up to save her. What happened next will change the way you see kindness forever. Comments below where you're watching from, and if you like and love our story, kindly subscribe our channel. Life, inspirational, and motivational tales that explore themes of love, unity, and patriotism. Stay with us always for interesting stories. Thanks. Let's start the story. The late afternoon sun casts golden streaks across Maple Grove, a picturesque suburban neighborhood where the leaves of tall trees sway gently in the breeze. The houses stand in near-perfect symmetry, their lawns freshly mowed and driveways spotless. There's a hum of distant life, dogs barking in backyards, faint laughter from children playing down the street, and the sound of an occasional car passing by. It's a neighborhood where everything seems serene, yet beneath the polished veneer, unspoken tensions lie. Clara Williams lives at 312 Maple Grove Lane, 2 doors down from a man she often judges with a bitterness that spills over into her casual conversations with neighbors. Clara is in her early 40s, her sharp demeanor and curt tone making her presence well known. She wears her pride like a badge, always quick to assume and slow to understand. Her disapproving stares and offhand comments often land on David Brown, a man who has lived quietly in the same neighborhood for years. David is in his late 30s, a tall and sturdy man with a kind, unassuming nature. He works as a maintenance professional, known for his reliability and willingness to help anyone who needs it. Whether it's fixing a leaking pipe or mowing someone's overgrown lawn, David does it all without seeking praise. He keeps to himself, moving through the neighborhood like a steady, silent presence. Despite his kindness, Clara sees only what she chooses to see, a man who to her doesn't belong. Their encounters are always brief but cold. When David passes by, pushing his toolbox along the sidewalk, Clara makes sure to clutch her purse a little tighter. When he waves politely, she barely nods. "Must be nice," she once muttered, loud enough for him to hear, "to have all the time in the world to stroll around doing who knows what." David pauses on the steps and hurries on at the same speed as DePaul, never engaging. He simply smiles faintly and keeps walking, leaving Clara to her assumption. On this particular afternoon, the neighborhood feels even quieter than usual. Most people are away at work and children have yet to return from school. The sun is starting its slow descent, dipping lower on the horizon and casting long shadows across Clara's lawn. Inside her house, Clara prepares herself a cup of tea. She sighs, glancing out the window, scowling slightly as she sees David walking home in the distance. She doesn't dwell on him for long. Clara turns back toward her kitchen table when, without warning, a sudden wave of dizziness crashes over her. The room tilts, and her chest tightens with a sharp, unbearable pain. The cup in her hand falls to the floor with a crash, and she stumbles toward the counter, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Her hand reaches way. Clara collapses onto the floor, her head hitting the hardwood with a dull thud. The house falls silent again, save for the faint ticking of a wall clock and the distant chirp of birds outside. Hours pass. The sunlight that had filled the room begins to fade, giving way to the soft shadows of early evening. Clara lies motionless on the floor, her breathing faint, her heartbeat irregular. No one notices. Her phone rests just out of reach on the counter, its screen dark and useless. The street outside remains peaceful, oblivious to what's happening behind Clara's closed doors. At the same time, David is finishing his day's work a few streets over. His hands are streaked with grease, his clothes speckled with the evidence of a long shift spent fixing broken fences and repairing old plumbing. He slings his bag of tools over his shoulder, wiping his brow as he begins the familiar walk home. The quiet of Maple Grove is something David has always appreciated. No chaos, no noise, just peace at the end of the day. As he approaches Clara's house, something catches his attention. At first it's subtle, the way her car sits slightly askew in the driveway, as if it was parked in a hurry. Then he notices the front door. It's ajar, just a crack, but enough to stand out in a neighborhood where people pride themselves on locked doors and drawn curtains. David slows his pace, his eyes narrowing in sight. Something isn't right. David can feel it in his gut. He pauses at the edge of her driveway, uncertain. Clara has made it perfectly clear over the years that she doesn't like him. She doesn't trust him. And yet, he can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. He lingers there for a moment, his mind battling itself. He could just keep walking, pretend he didn't see anything, but his instincts won't let him. Pushing his doubts aside, David sets his tools down and steps cautiously toward the front door. He carefully examines the wooden planks. "Mrs. Williams?" he calls out, his voice calm but loud enough to be heard. He waits a beat, listening, but there's no answer. He steps closer, gently pushing the door open a little farther. The house is dim, the evening light barely spilling in through the windows. "Hello? Everything okay there?" Still nothing. David's heart beats a little faster as he steps inside, his shoes creaking on the hardwood floor. He scans the living room, the hallway. Everything looks normal at first glance. But then he sees her. Clara's motionless form lies crumpled on the kitchen floor, her face pale, her breathing shallow. For a moment, time seems to freeze. David feels a cold rush of adrenaline, his mind snapping into focus. "Mrs. Williams," he says urgently, hurrying to her side. He kneels down, his hands hovering uncertainly before gently shaking her shoulder. She doesn't respond. David checks her pulse, relieved to feel it, faint but there. Without wasting another second, he pulls his phone from his pocket and dials emergency services. As the call connects, his voice remains steady as he gives the operator Clara's address and describes her condition. "She's unconscious but breathing," he says, glancing around the room for anything that might explain what happened. "Please hurry." The minutes that follow feel like an eternity. David stays by Clara's side, carefully positioning her to keep her airway clear, his voice calm as he murmurs reassurances, more for himself than for her. Outside, the distant sound of sirens grows louder, cutting through the evening quiet. Finally, an ambulance pulls up in front of the house, its lights flashing red and blue against the darkening sky. Paramedics rush in, taking over as David steps back. He watches silently as they work, lifting Clara onto a stretcher and wheeling her out the door. One of the paramedics pauses to speak to him. "You did the right thing checking on her," the man says with a nod of gratitude. "You may have saved her life." He scrapes his clothes as if he and Clara had been changing for the worst 10 minutes, then nods at David. David just nods, his face unreadable, before stepping outside. He stands in the driveway, watching as the ambulance drives off, its sirens fading into the distance. The street is quiet again. the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. David picks up his tools and slings them over his shoulder, his expression calm but thoughtful as he makes his way home. He doesn't linger on what just happened. To him, it was simple. Someone needed help, and he did what he knew was right. It doesn't matter who she is or how she's treated him in the past. David's heart tells him to do the right thing, and that's all there is to it. In the distance, lights begin flicking on in the houses along Maple Grove, families settling in for the night, unaware of the quiet hero who walked among them. David disappears down the street, the shadows of the evening swallowing him, as if he'd never been there at all. Inexplicably, the faces of both David and Louise start to fade, as if he'd never been there at all. The air outside Clara Williams' house felt unnaturally still as David stood at the edge of her driveway. He stared at the cracked open front door, a chill running down his spine as his instincts screamed that something was wrong. David had seen Clara's car in the driveway, parked haphazardly like she'd been in a hurry, but the ajar door was the real warning sign. For someone as meticulous as Clara, leaving her home unsecured was unthinkable. "Mrs. Williams?" David called out from the sidewalk, his deep voice cutting through the quiet evening. He waited a moment, listening intently, but no sound came in response. No footsteps, no rustling inside. His heart began to thud harder against his ribs. "Mrs. Williams?" He tried again, this time a little louder. Still nothing. Steve." Every fiber of his being told him to walk away, to mind his business, but David couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at him. He hesitated, his gaze flickering between the door and the empty street. Finally, with a firm breath, he moved toward the house. Stepping onto the porch, he knocked sharply, the sound echoing through the street. "Anyone home? It's David, from down the street." The door creaked slightly as he touched it, pushing inward without resistance. "I'm coming in to check," he announced, his voice firm but calm. The house was dim, the late afternoon light filtering faintly through half-drawn curtains. A clock ticked rhythmically in the background, and the faint hum of an appliance buzzed somewhere deeper in the house. Otherwise, the silence was unnerving. David's footsteps were deliberate as he moved through the entryway. "Hello? Mrs. Williams?" His voice sounded out of place in the empty house. He glanced into the living room. Nothing. The dining area, empty. Then he stepped into the kitchen, and his breath caught in his throat. There she was. Clara lay sprawled across the kitchen floor, her pale face turned slightly to the side. Her teacup lay shattered near her hand, a small stain of spilled liquid spreading across the tiles. For a moment David froze, his mind racing. Then instinct took over. He dropped to his knees beside her, reaching for her wrist to check for a pulse. It was faint but steady. Relief shot through him, but it was quickly overtaken by urgency. She was breathing but barely. "Mrs. Williams? Can you hear me?" David's voice was calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. He gently tapped her shoulder, but she remained unresponsive. His mind worked fast. He couldn't leave her like this. She needed help, and waiting for an ambulance might take too long. Every second counted. Carefully, David positioned his arms under her, lifting her as gently as he could. Clara was slight compared to his sturdy frame, but carrying her wasn't easy. "Hang on," he murmured, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he carried her out the front door, navigating the steps down the porch and across the driveway to his car. He opened the back door and laid her down across the seat, making sure she was comfortable before shutting the door behind her. The urgency of the moment sharpened his focus as David climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and without hesitation, he pulled out of the driveway. The tire skidded slightly on the pavement as he turned onto the main road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. His mind raced alongside the car's engine. Glancing in the rearview mirror, he saw Clara's still form in the back seat, her face pale and lifeless. "You're going to be okay," he said aloud, more to steady himself than anything. The words filled the silence of the car, though Clara didn't stir. "Just hold on." David's thoughts swirled as he drove, his foot pressing the gas pedal a little harder than usual. He knew this woman. He knew how she had looked at him for years, her stare sharp with judgment. He remembered her snide remarks, her clipped words as they passed each other on the sidewalk. She had treated him like he was less, someone to be tolerated, not respected. And yet, none of that mattered now. None of it even crossed his mind as he raced against time to get her the help she needed. The road to the hospital stretched on forever, or so it seemed. Red traffic lights felt unbearably long, and every car that slowed him down made David's pulse quicken. But he didn't falter. He took deep breaths, his focus unwavering. He had been raised to do what was right, no matter what. Clara needed help, and that was all that mattered. After what felt like an eternity, the bright lights of Riverfield General Hospital came into view. David's car screeched to a stop at the emergency entrance, and he leapt out, waving frantically at the medical staff. "I need help. She's unconscious." His voice boomed through the entrance, drawing the attention of doctors and nurses who rushed toward the vehicle with a stretcher. David opened the back door carefully as two nurses hurried over. They assessed Clara's condition and lifted her onto the stretcher with swift precision. A doctor leaned toward David, his voice brisk but grateful. "What happened? How long has she been like this?" "I don't know," David admitted, still catching his breath. "I was passing by her house and noticed something wasn't right. I found her on the floor. She was breathing, but unresponsive." The doctor nodded, already signaling to the staff to move quickly. They left her and went back inside. As the automatic doors slid shut behind the stretcher, David stood there for a moment, feeling the adrenaline finally begin to fade. He rubbed his hands over his face, exhaling slowly as he took in his surroundings. The bustling hospital entrance seemed surreal after the stillness of Clara's kitchen and the quiet drive over. It struck him suddenly just how close she had come to being left there alone, unnoticed. A nurse returned to the doorway, approaching David with a small, reassuring smile. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "Getting her here quickly might have saved her life." David nodded, his voice low. "Will she be okay?" "She's in good hands now," the nurse replied. "They'll do everything they can." David stepped back, nodding again. "Thank you." He turned and made his way toward the parking lot, his legs feeling heavier with each step. The weight of the situation lingered, but so did the sense of quiet satisfaction that he had done the right thing. He glanced back at the hospital one last time, the bright red letters glowing against the evening sky, before climbing into his car. As he drove home, the neighborhood was shrouded in twilight. The lights in the houses along Maple Grove Lane were beginning to flicker on, each home settling into its evening rhythm. David pulled into his driveway, the quiet returning around him. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. In his heart, he knew he would have done the same for anyone, no matter who they were or how they treated him. 2 minutes later, he sighed and said goodbye. Inside the hospital, Clara lay under the bright, sterile lights of the emergency room, machines beeping steadily as the doctors worked to stabilize her. She remained unaware of the man who had saved her life, unaware of the judgment she had carried for him or the quiet strength he had shown. But soon she would learn the truth. And when she did, it would change her forever. Clara's first moments of consciousness were blurry, as though she were emerging from the depths of a deep, heavy sleep. The rhythmic beat of the heart monitor and the sterile smell of antiseptics filled the air, grounding her in an unfamiliar environment. The ceiling above her was stark white, the fluorescent lights humming faintly, and the steady murmur of voices beyond the door hinted that she wasn't alone. Her throat felt dry as she shifted slightly in the hospital bed, the cool sheets rustling under her fingertips. She blinked slowly, taking in her surroundings, confusion knitting her brow. Where am I? The last thing she remembered was reaching for her tea, a sudden tightness in her chest, and then darkness. Her mind strained to recall what happened next. Fragments of sensations floated in her memory, strong arms lifting her, the sound of car tires on the pavement, a calm voice murmuring reassurance. It didn't make sense. The last thing she remembered was a bunch of pills on her pillow. The door creaked open, and a nurse stepped in, smiling warmly as she noticed Clara stirring. "Good to see you awake, Mrs. Williams," the nurse said, checking the monitors beside the bed. "You gave us all quite a scare." "Well, what happened?" Clara croaked, her voice hoarse. "You were brought in unconscious," the nurse explained gently. "It looks like you collapsed from a sudden drop in blood pressure. Luckily, you were found just in time." Clara frowned, trying to process the words. "Who?" The nurse glanced at the chart in her hand. "A gentleman named David Brown. He brought you here as fast as he could. If it weren't for him, things might have turned out differently." Clara's breath caught, her heart skipping a beat. David Brown? The name echoed in her head, stirring a whirlwind of emotions. Surely it couldn't be the David Brown, her neighbor, the man she had spent years ignoring, dismissing, and ridiculing. The memory of his calm, steady presence in her life. The polite greetings, the way she had treated him, collided with the bitter way she had treated him, and now he was the reason she was lying here, alive. The nurse patted her arm gently. "You're lucky to have a neighbor like him," she said, before stepping out of the room, leaving Clara in stunned silence. Clara lay still, staring at the ceiling as tears began to sting her eyes. Shame coiled tightly in her chest, more suffocating than the illness that had felled her. She remembered every cutting remark she had ever made toward David, the comments about his job, her clipped tone when he greeted her on the street, the way she'd muttered under her breath when he passed by. "Happy day, do you always feel so insignificant?" To Clara, he had always been just an inconvenience, a man she didn't think twice about, someone she wrongly judged without ever trying to understand. Her life with Hamilton would surely be better without him. Her mind wandered back to those years of small cruelties, each memory sharper than the last. The sting of guilt weighed heavily on her. How could someone she had treated so unfairly show her such compassion? Why hadn't he just walked away and left her there? Tears slid down her cheeks as she whispered to herself, "Oh, what kind of person have I been?" The hours stretched long as Clara wrestled with her thoughts. Her body ached, but it was nothing compared to the ache of regret swelling in her heart. She thought of David, of the strength it must have taken to carry her, the kindness it took to ignore all of her insults and act without hesitation. She started walking. She closed her eyes tightly, the tears coming faster now. He didn't deserve her judgment, her ignorance, or her cruel words. And yet, when it mattered most, he had been there. The next morning, the sound of a gentle knock on her hospital door broke Clara from her restless thoughts. She glanced up just as the door opened, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway was David Brown. In very few words, the interview professional journalist presented Brown with a set of pictures of her experience with diabetes, which he held up while explaining how she came to have diabetes in the first place, holding a small, simple bouquet of yellow daisies in his hands. He looked much the same as always, tall, calm, and unassuming, but there was something about his presence now that felt different to Clara. This was the man who had saved her life. "Morning, Mrs. Williams," David said softly, stepping into the room. His voice was warm, his tone gentle, as though he didn't want to disturb her. He placed the flowers on the small bedside table, his movements measured. "Just wanted to check on you." Clara tried to sit up straighter, her hands trembling as she clutched the thin hospital blanket. She didn't know where to start, how to say the words that weighed so heavily on her chest. "David," she began, her voice cracking, her eyes filled with tears, shame and gratitude swirling together until the emotions became impossible to separate. I don't even know what to say." David tilted his head slightly, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "You don't need to say anything," he replied quietly. "No," Clara said firmly, her voice thick with emotion. I need to apologize." She paused, struggling to find the right words. "For everything I've ever said to you, for how I treated you. I was so wrong." She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I judged you. I looked at you and decided things about you that I had no right to think, and yet you saved me. You didn't have to, but you did." David regarded her for a long moment, his eyes kind and steady. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and forgiving. "You don't owe me an apology, Clara," he said softly. "I wasn't going to let anything happen to you. We're neighbors. That's what you do." Clara broke down then, her face crumpling as sobs racked her thin frame. "I don't deserve your kindness," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Not after everything I've done." Clara felt David reached out, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. His touch was gentle, grounding. "We all make mistakes," he said simply, his words carrying no judgment. "I never took it to heart. Life's too short for grudges. What matters is that you're okay. Excuse me." His words struck her to the core. Clara looked up at him through tear-filled eyes, her heart swelling with a mix of regret and relief. The man she had spent years belittling, ignoring, and misunderstanding was now standing before her, offering her a forgiveness she didn't deserve. "Thank you," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for saving my life." He raised his hands as if apologizing. David gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze before stepping back, his smile warm but faint. "Take care of yourself, Clara," he said quietly, before turning to leave the room. He didn't linger or demand gratitude. He simply did what he had always done, what was right. As the door closed softly behind him, Clara stared after him, her heart heavy but lighter all at once. She wiped at her tears, feeling a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, she realized how small her world had been, how much beauty and goodness she had ignored because of her own prejudice. David Brown had shown her not only kindness, but grace, and it had changed her. Clara lay back against the pillow, her tears slowing. She vowed then and there to be different, to see people for who they truly were, not for the assumptions she carried. And though the road ahead would be long, she knew one thing for certain. David had saved far more than her life that day. He had given her a second chance to live it right. Clara's return home was quieter than she had imagined. The familiar creak of the front door, the stillness of her living room, and the faint ticking of the old clock in the hallway all seemed louder somehow, as though the house itself had been waiting for her. She set down her hospital bag and lingered near the window, her gaze fixed on the neighborhood she once thought she knew so well. The late afternoon sunlight poured in through the curtains, casting warm streaks across the room. Outside, the hum of a lawnmower broke the silence. Clara looked out and, for the first time, watched David Brown without the usual judgment that had so often clouded her view. He was in his yard, pushing his lawnmower back and forth with quiet focus. His movements were steady, his posture relaxed, and there was something so simple yet admirable about the way he worked, unbothered, steady, and purposeful. Clara's chest tightened as a wave of regret washed over her. How many times had she stared at him before, letting her assumptions and prejudices fill in blanks she never tried to understand? She thought back to her time in the hospital, David's voice and calm presence saving her when no one else knew she was in danger. The shame she'd felt then hadn't left her. If anything, it had grown stronger now that she was home, surrounded by the reminders of her old ways. She sat at the edge of her couch, her mind restless. After an hour of pacing her kitchen and wrestling with ideas, Clara finally settled on something simple. She pulled out a mixing bowl and started baking. Baking wasn't something Clara did often. Her friends would have laughed if they'd seen her fussing over flour and sugar. But it felt right. Her movements were deliberate as she measured, mixed, and shaped dough into imperfect little rounds. She didn't have much experience with baking, but she didn't care. It wasn't about perfection, it was about effort, about showing her gratitude in a small, heartfelt way. When the cookies were done, their faint, sweet scent filled the house, and Clara carefully arranged them on a plate. The distance felt longer than it ever had. With every step, Clara's heart beat louder in her chest. When she reached his door, she stood there for a moment, gathering her courage before raising her hand to knock. The sound seemed impossibly loud as it echoed against the wood. David answered quickly, his face calm and composed as always. He looked slightly surprised to see Clara standing there, a plate of cookies in her hands. but his expression softened. "Clara," he said gently, as though he didn't want to startle her. Clara shifted awkwardly, forcing a small, uncertain smile. "Hi, David," she said, her voice quiet. She held out the plate of cookies, her hands trembling slightly. I brought these for you, as a thank you." David looked at the cookies, then back at Clara, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Thank you," he said simply, accepting the plate from her hands. His voice carried no hint of resentment or sarcasm, only genuine gratitude. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly feeling exposed standing there on his porch. I wanted to say thank you again. For everything," she said softly. "And I wanted to apologize, really apologize. I've been awful to you. I've said things I'm not proud of, and I judge you without ever knowing you. I was wrong." David studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful but kind. Then, to her surprise, he shook his head slightly. "Clara, it's all in the past," he said gently. "You don't need to keep apologizing." "But I do," Clara insisted, her voice trembling. "I need you to know I'm sorry. I can't change the things I've said, but I can promise to be better. You didn't have to help me, and you did. I'll never forget that." David's smile deepened, and his voice remained calm. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is that you're here now." For the first time in years, Clara felt as though a weight had been lifted. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, David. Really." They stood there in silence for a moment, the awkward tension she'd expected replaced with something else, something warm and sincere. David gestured toward his lawn, where the mower sat idling. "I was just finishing up here. Let me know if you ever need anything, all right?" Clara smiled, a real smile, the kind that felt unfamiliar but good. "I will," she said softly. "And, enjoy the cookies. I hope they're edible." David chuckled lightly, his shoulders relaxing. "I'm sure they'll be great." Felmy saw. As Clara turned to walk back to her house, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just about thanking David or apologizing anymore. It was about change, real change. She had seen firsthand how wrong her assumptions had been. David had shown her grace when he had every reason to turn his back on her. He had reminded her through his actions that there was goodness in the world, even when she had refused to see it. Over the days that followed, Clara found herself seeing David and the world differently. The next time she saw him mowing his lawn, she waved first, her hand lifting instinctively. David waved back, his easy smile reassuring her that things were different now. The silence that had once separated them was gone, replaced by polite exchanges and small conversations. Clara no longer crossed the street to avoid him. She no longer felt the need to justify her prejudices with whispered remarks or judgmental glances. The neighborhood noticed, too. People who had seen Clara's cold behavior in the past began to take note of her change. And though it was subtle, just a smile here, a greeting there, it mattered. For Clara, it wasn't just about making amends to David. It was about changing how she approached the world. She realized how easy it had been to let fear and ignorance guide her, and she vowed never to let them hold her back again. Since 2006, one evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Clara stood on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood settle into its quiet rhythm. David was across the street, walking his dog. He glanced up, and when their eyes met, he waved. Clara waved back, a small but genuine smile tugging at her lips. In that simple moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. David's kindness had opened her eyes to something she'd been blind to for years, that people were more than appearances, more than assumptions. It was a lesson she would carry with her, one that had saved far more than her life. "Wherever you are," she said, walking past him into the living room for dinner. "It's a time," and though she couldn't undo the past, Clara knew she could be better in the days ahead. For herself, for her neighbors, and for the man who had shown her the power of compassion when she least deserved it. Clara sat on her porch that warm afternoon, her gaze drifting across the neighborhood she had lived in for years. It was familiar, yet somehow it felt different now, brighter, warmer, as though the invisible walls she had once built between herself and others had finally crumbled. The laughter of children echoed through the streets. The faint hum of a lawnmower buzzed in the distance, and the air carried the soft scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers. It was a scene of peace, but more importantly, it was a reflection of change. From her seat, Clara caught sight of David across the street. He was in his usual work clothes, sleeves rolled up as he helped an elderly neighbor fix a broken fence. His movements were steady and deliberate, his face calm and focused. Even as sweat beaded on his brow, there was no complaint, no hesitation. Just the quiet generosity that Clara had come to associate with him. She watched, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. For so long she had let herself see only what she wanted to see, her biases, her judgments, and her ignorance painting an unfair picture. Now she saw David for who he truly was. A good man, a kind man, and a better neighbor than she had ever been. Clara stood up, grabbed 2 glasses of lemonade from her kitchen, and began walking toward him. Her steps were lighter than they had been in years. This simple gesture was her way of showing that the person she used to be, the cold, judgmental woman she was ashamed of, was fading into the past. Each step toward David felt like a step toward something new: understanding, acceptance, and friendship. David looked up as she approached, pausing in his work and wiping his hands on his jeans. His familiar smile was already in place, that unshakable calmness surrounding him like always. Clara extended one of the glasses of lemonade toward him, her voice soft but steady. "You look like you could use this," she said. David chuckled, taking the glass with a nod of thanks. "Perfect timing. You must have read my mind." Clara smiled, sitting down on a patch of grass beneath the shade of an old oak tree. David followed her lead, easing himself onto the ground beside her. They sat quietly for a moment, sipping their lemonade and letting the afternoon breeze settle around them. It was comfortable, natural, something Clara never imagined she would experience with him. After a while, Clara broke the silence, her tone quiet but sincere. "I've learned a lot from you, David," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you for not holding my mistakes against me." David turned his head, studying her for a moment before smiling warmly. "We all have moments we're not proud of," he said gently. What matters is how we move forward. His words settled over Clara like a bomb, softening the last remnants of guilt she carried. She realized then that forgiveness, David's forgiveness, wasn't just something he gave her. It was something he lived by. His kindness hadn't come with conditions, and his actions spoke louder than any judgment ever could. And Clara looked out at the neighborhood, watching children race down the sidewalk, their laughter filling the air like music. She thought back to that fateful day, the sudden illness, the helplessness she had felt on her living room floor, and the strong arms that carried her to safety. She had come so close to losing her life, and yet the very person she had mistreated the most had been the one to save it. It was humbling. It was life-changing. Clara leaned back against the tree trunk, letting the cool shade soothe her as the sunlight danced through the leaves. "You know," she said after a moment, "I used to think this neighborhood was perfect because everyone kept to themselves. I thought that was peace. But it wasn't. It was just distance." She paused, her voice thoughtful. "I don't want to live like that anymore." David nodded, his smile faint but understanding. Community isn't about keeping to yourself. It's about being there for each other when it matters. Clara's heart swelled with gratitude. She had spent so much time isolating herself, building barriers between her and others, especially David. And yet, when it mattered most, he had shown her the true meaning of community without hesitation or bitterness. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Clara sat with David beneath the oak tree, the world around them filled with the sounds of life. Neighbors chatting, children playing, the faint hum of cars passing by. It was a simple moment, but it felt monumental to Clara. For years she had carried resentment and prejudice like a heavy chain, but now it was as though that weight had finally lifted. When David eventually stood to return to his work, Clara watched him go with a sense of peace. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she also knew she didn't have to live in it. From that day forward, Clara became an advocate for kindness in her community. She shared her story with friends and neighbors, encouraging them to see people for who they really were, not who they assumed them to be. Her relationship with David blossomed into one of mutual respect and understanding. They greeted each other warmly each morning, exchanged small talk about the weather or their days, and occasionally shared lemonade under the shade of the same oak tree. For Clara, those moments became a reminder of the lessons she had learned. Lessons about humility, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of human kindness. As the sun began to set, casting the neighborhood in shades of gold and orange, Clara sat back on her porch, watching the world settle into calm. She thought of how close she had come to not being here at all, and as her gaze drifted back to David, still hard at work, still giving so freely of himself, she smiled softly, knowing that he had not only saved her life, but changed it forever. Clara now understood a simple, undeniable truth. Sometimes the people we judge the harshest are the ones who teach us the most important lessons about kindness, forgiveness, and humanity. And in that understanding, Clara found not just gratitude, but a sense of purpose that would stay with her for the rest of her days. We want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where kindness changed everything? Share your thoughts or real-life stories in the comments below. Let's inspire each other with tales of compassion and forgiveness. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more uplifting content.